3 brand-new American destroyers. 1 suicide mission into the most heavily defended bay in the Pacific. Midnight, December 6, 1944. They had 1 hour to destroy Japan's last lifeline to Leyte or die trying. What happened next would become one of the most brutal naval battles you've never heard of. 1 ship would sink in under 60 seconds. Dozens of men would vanish into burning oil and darkness. And the survivors? They would have to swim through hell itself. This is the story of the night Ormoc Bay became a graveyard, and how 3 destroyers changed the course of the war. The Pacific Ocean does not forgive, and on the night of December 6, 1944, it offered no mercy to the men sailing into its darkest corner. The sea was black as crude oil, restless and cold, heaving beneath a moonless sky that promised nothing but violence. 3 American destroyers cut through those waters like knives through silk, their hulls trembling with the raw power of turbines pushing them toward a destination that every man aboard knew might be their last. USS Allen M. Sumner, USS Moale, and USS Cooper, Sumner-class destroyers, the newest and deadliest warships in the United States Navy, sleek predators of steel and fury, each one bristling with 5-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and enough firepower to level a city block. They were magnificent machines, barely broken in, their paint still fresh, their crews still learning the rhythm of their decks, and they were sailing straight into hell. Ormoc Bay, even the name carried weight, whispered among sailors with a mixture of dread and fatalism. It sat on the western coast of Leyte, a natural harbor carved into the Philippine Islands, surrounded by jungle-covered mountains and fortified beaches. For weeks it had been Japan's last artery, the final route through which supplies, reinforcements, and ammunition flowed to the 40,000 troops desperately clinging to the island. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, had staked everything on holding Leyte. Douglas MacArthur, who had waded ashore with cameras rolling and proclaimed his return to the Philippines, had staked his legacy on taking it. Between them, caught in the grinding machinery of empire and liberation, were tens of thousands of men who would kill or die in the mud, the jungle, and the water. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, had ended only weeks before, leaving the Philippine Sea littered with wreckage and the ghosts of thousands of sailors. But the fighting had not stopped. It had simply moved inland, into the rice paddies and hills and tangled rainforests where American soldiers pushed forward yard by bloody yard, while Japanese defenders fought with the ferocity of men who knew retreat was not an option. Ormoc Bay was the key. As long as Japan could resupply through that harbor, the battle would drag on, consuming lives by the thousands. As long as that bay remained open, Yamashita's forces could hold, could bleed the Americans white in a war of attrition that neither side could afford. And so the order came down from Admiral Thomas Kinkaid himself. Close the bay, destroy the supply lines, cut the throat of the Japanese defense, whatever the cost. The mission fell to Destroyer Squadron 60, 3 ships that had been commissioned only months before, crews that had barely tasted combat, sailors who still wrote letters home describing the beauty of the Pacific sunsets and the strange thrill of being part of something larger than themselves. They had no illusions about what awaited them. Intelligence reports painted a picture of a fortress. Coastal artillery batteries hidden in the hills, their guns zeroed in on the narrow entrance to the bay. Minefields sown across the approaches, silent killers lurking just beneath the surface. Japanese aircraft based at nearby airfields, ready to swarm anything that dared venture close. Submarines prowling the depths, patient and invisible. And Japanese warships, destroyers and transports that would not go quietly into the night. The plan was simple in the way that suicide missions often are. The 3 destroyers would approach Ormoc Bay under cover of darkness, threading through the minefield using the latest intelligence and a great deal of luck. They would enter the bay at midnight, when visibility was lowest and Japanese gunners would struggle to acquire targets. Then, for 1 precious hour, they would unleash everything they had, shelling the docks, sinking transport ships, destroying supply depots, turning Japan's lifeline into a killing field. And then, before dawn could betray them, they would race back out to sea, hoping to outrun the inevitable counterattack. It was audacious. It was desperate. It was exactly the kind of operation that won wars or created widows. The men of the Allen M. Sumner, Moale, and Cooper understood this as they stood at their battle stations, the warm Pacific wind whipping across the decks, carrying with it the smell of diesel fuel and salt water and the faint acrid tang of distant smoke. Some of them were still teenagers, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, kids who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor with fire in their hearts and had found themselves half a world away, standing on the deck of a warship about to sail into legend or oblivion. Others were veterans, men who had seen action at Tarawa or Saipan or in the grinding island-hopping campaign that had brought them here, men whose hands no longer shook when the guns fired, whose eyes had gone hard and distant. They checked their equipment with practiced efficiency, life jackets secured, helmets strapped tight, ammunition belts loaded, fire hoses ready. They wrote last letters in their minds, prayers that would never be spoken aloud. They thought of home, of mothers and sweethearts and children they might never see again, and they sailed on. The approach to Ormoc Bay began in late afternoon, a slow and agonizing journey through waters that felt increasingly hostile with every mile. The destroyers moved in a tight formation, their lookouts scanning the horizon for the telltale silhouette of aircraft or the white wake of a periscope cutting through the waves. The sun hung low and red, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered bronze, beautiful and indifferent. And then the attacks began. Japanese reconnaissance planes spotted them first, high-altitude observers radiating their position back to every airfield within striking distance. Then came the bombers, twin-engine Mitsubishi G4MS that the Americans called Bettys, graceful and deadly, their bomb bays loaded with death. The destroyers' radar operators called out bearings and distances, their voices crackling over the intercom, calm and professional even as their hearts hammered in their chests. The 5-inch guns swiveled skyward, barrels elevating, and the world erupted in thunder. The sound of a 5-inch gun firing is not something you hear so much as feel, a concussion that rattles your teeth and vibrates through your bones, turning the air itself into a physical force. The destroyers fired in rapid succession, their anti-aircraft batteries spitting shells into the sky, creating a curtain of flak that blossomed into black flowers against the fading light. Tracers arced upward, red and white streaks that seemed to hang in the air before falling away into the sea. The Japanese bombers came in low and fast, their engines screaming, and the men on deck watched them grow larger, closer, until they could see the rivets on the fuselages and the faces of the pilots behind the glass. Bombs fell, whistling down through the air, and the destroyers heeled hard to port, to starboard, zigzagging through the water with an agility that seemed impossible for vessels displacing over 2,000 tons. Geysers of water erupted where the bombs struck, towering columns that rose higher than the ship's masts before collapsing back into the sea, drenching the crews with spray that tasted of salt and cordite. One bomber, trailing smoke from a shattered engine, came in so low that its belly nearly scraped the waves, heading straight for the Moale in a final desperate attempt to take an American ship with it. Every gun on the destroyer opened fire, the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons hammering away in a continuous stream, the muzzle flashes so bright they left afterimages burned into the retinas of the men who watched. The bomber disintegrated mid-flight, torn apart by the weight of fire, pieces of fuselage and wing and human body spinning into the ocean in a trail of fire and debris. The crew of the Moale did not cheer. There was no time. Another wave of aircraft was already inbound, and the guns never stopped firing, the barrels glowing red-hot, the ammunition handlers working in a frenzy to keep them fed, their hands blistered and bleeding, their faces streaked with sweat and smoke. For over an hour they fought, 3 destroyers against the entire Imperial Japanese Air Force, or so it seemed to the men who lived through it. The sky was a chaos of tracer fire and explosions, the sea a churning cauldron of bomb splashes and wakes. Men died on those decks, killed by shrapnel, by bomb fragments, by pieces of their own ships torn loose and hurled through the air like shrapnel. Corpsmen worked frantically in the cramped spaces below decks, their hands slick with blood, their voices hoarse from shouting over the din. And still the destroyers pushed forward, closer to Ormoc Bay, closer to their objective, because turning back was not an option, because the mission was everything, because if they failed then men would continue to die in the jungles of Leyte for weeks or months while Japan poured reinforcements through that bay. As the sun finally sank below the horizon, the attacks tapered off. The Japanese pilots, running low on fuel and ammunition, turned back toward their bases, leaving the 3 destroyers battered but afloat, their crews exhausted and shaken but alive. The ocean turned from bronze to gray to black, and a deep silence settled over the water, broken only by the steady thrum of the turbines and the hiss of the bow waves cutting through the dark. The men stood at their stations, breathing hard, their ears ringing from the gunfire, and stared into the darkness ahead. They had survived the approach. Now came the hard part. Midnight. The 3 destroyers reduced speed as they neared the entrance to Ormoc Bay, their bows cutting through water that seemed thicker here, heavier, as though the bay itself resisted their intrusion. The mountains rose on either side, invisible black masses against a slightly less black sky, their peaks lost in low clouds. No lights showed on shore. The Japanese were not fools, but the Americans knew they were there, watching, waiting, fingers on triggers and lanyards, ready to unleash hell the moment the destroyers revealed themselves. The captains conferred briefly over the radio, their voices tight with tension, and then the order was given. All ahead full. The turbines roared, the destroyers leapt forward, and they charged into Ormoc Bay with guns blazing. The first salvo lit up the night like a string of flashbulbs, the 5-inch guns firing in sequence, the muzzle flashes so bright they turned the water white and threw stark shadows across the decks. The shells screamed inland, arcing over the water and slamming into the docks and warehouses that lined the shore. Explosions blossomed in the darkness, orange and red, painting the underside of the clouds with hellish light. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition stores and fuel dumps ignited, fireballs rolling skyward, the shock waves rippling across the water and shaking the destroyers like toys. The Japanese responded instantly. Coastal artillery opened up from hidden positions in the hills, their guns spitting flame, and suddenly the bay was alive with fire from every direction. Shells shrieked overhead, some falling short and sending up geysers of water, others whistling past so close that the men could feel the wind of their passage. The destroyers zigzagged through the chaos, their 5-inch guns hammering away, their 40mm and 20mm batteries engaging targets of opportunity, raking the shoreline with a continuous stream of fire that tore through buildings and boats and anything that moved. And there, silhouetted against the flames, the hulking shape of a Japanese transport ship, loaded with supplies and troops, anchored near the docks. The Allen M. Sumner acquired the target, adjusted range and bearing, and fired. The first shells struck the waterline, punching through the thin hull plating and detonating inside the cargo holds. The transport shuddered, listed, and within minutes was sliding beneath the surface, taking with it hundreds of tons of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and the hopes of the Japanese soldiers waiting desperately for resupply. Another target appeared, a destroyer, the Kua, a Matsu-class vessel that had been undergoing repairs and was caught unprepared by the sudden onslaught. The Japanese crew scrambled to man their guns, but they were too slow. The Moale and Cooper bracketed the Kua with fire, their shells walking up the length of the enemy destroyer, smashing gun mounts, tearing open compartments, igniting fires that spread with terrifying speed. The Kua tried to maneuver, tried to bring her own weapons to bear, but she was already dying, already doomed. A torpedo from the Cooper finished the job, striking amidships and breaking the destroyer's back. She went down in less than 10 minutes, her stern rising high into the air before she plunged into the depths, taking most of her crew with her. The Americans had been in the bay for less than 20 minutes, and already they had inflicted catastrophic damage. But the Japanese were not finished. Hidden among the islands and coves that dotted Ormoc Bay, Japanese submarines had been lying in wait, their crews silent and patient, listening to the thunder of battle through their hydrophones, calculating angles and speeds. One of them, RO-41, acquired a target, the USS Cooper, silhouetted against the flames from shore, her profile unmistakable. The submarine commander gave the order, and 4 torpedoes leapt from their tubes, racing through the water at 40 knots, their wakes barely visible in the darkness. No one aboard the Cooper saw them coming. The first indication of danger was the explosion, a massive concussion that lifted the destroyer's bow out of the water and snapped her keel like a dry stick. The torpedo had struck just forward of the bridge, detonating in the forward magazine where hundreds of 5-inch shells were stored. The secondary explosion was apocalyptic, a fireball that consumed the entire forward section of the ship, vaporizing men where they stood, hurling pieces of steel and machinery hundreds of feet into the air. The shock wave rolled across the water, slamming into the Moale and Sumner with enough force to knock men off their feet. And the Cooper, one of the most advanced destroyers in the United States Navy, began to die. She went down fast, faster than anyone could have imagined. The forward half of the ship simply ceased to exist, torn apart by the explosion, and the sea rushed in with unstoppable force. The Cooper rolled to starboard, her remaining deck tilting at an impossible angle, and men scrambled for handholds, for life jackets, for anything that might save them. There was no time for lifeboats, no time for orderly evacuation. 57 seconds. That was how long it took from the moment the torpedo struck to the moment the Cooper's stern rose vertical and she plunged into the darkness, her screws still turning uselessly in the air. Men leapt from the deck, tumbling into the water, some hitting debris, some hitting other men, some simply vanishing into the black. Others were trapped below, in the engine rooms and magazines and crew quarters, their screams cut short as the ocean swallowed the ship whole. The survivors found themselves in a nightmare. The water was thick with fuel oil, a viscous black sludge that burned the eyes and choked the lungs, that clung to skin and clothing and made swimming almost impossible. The oil was on fire in places, burning with a greasy orange flame that spread across the surface, forcing men to dive beneath the water to escape the heat, holding their breath until their lungs screamed, surfacing only to find the fire had moved or the smoke had grown thicker. Explosions continued as depth charges and ammunition cooked off in the wreckage below, sending shockwaves through the water that felt like hammers to the chest, stunning men, disorienting them, stealing their strength. And above it all, the battle continued to rage, the Moale and Sumner still engaging targets on shore, still dodging artillery fire, unable to stop, unable to help, because stopping meant death for everyone. Earl H. Taylor, a young sailor from the Cooper, found himself alone in the darkness, treading water, his life jacket barely keeping him afloat as the weight of his soaked uniform tried to drag him down. He could hear voices in the darkness, other survivors calling out, some screaming for help, others eerily calm, reciting prayers or singing hymns. He swam toward the voices, trying to find others, trying to form a group, because isolation meant death, meant losing hope, meant giving in to the cold and the exhaustion and the terrible certainty that rescue might never come. He found 3 other men clinging to a piece of wreckage, a section of deck plating that bobbed in the waves, and together they held on, their fingers numb, their bodies shaking uncontrollably from shock and cold. They watched as the Moale and Sumner finally broke off the attack and raced out of the bay, their wakes phosphorescent in the darkness, and they felt a crushing wave of despair as the sound of the engines faded and they were left alone in the night with the dead and the dying. But Taylor and his companions did not give up. They oriented themselves toward Leyte, toward the American lines, and they began to swim, mile after mile through water that seemed to have no end, their arms heavy as lead, their legs cramping, their minds beginning to blur from exhaustion and dehydration. They swam through the night and into the dawn, the sun rising behind them, turning the water from black to gray to blue, mocking them with its beauty. And as the heat of the day built and their strength faded, they saw the coastline, saw the green line of jungle and the white strip of beach, and they found reserves of energy they did not know they possessed. They swam harder, faster, ignoring the pain, ignoring everything except that beach, that promise of salvation. They made landfall in the late afternoon, crawling out of the surf on hands and knees, collapsing on the sand, their bodies beyond exhausted, their minds barely functioning. And then figures emerged from the jungle, Filipino villagers, members of the local resistance, men and women who had been watching the battle from shore and who now came to help, bringing water and food and bandages, lifting the survivors and carrying them to safety. Taylor and the others wept with relief and gratitude, unable to speak, unable to do anything but grip the hands of their rescuers and silently thank whatever God had allowed them to survive. Other survivors were not so fortunate, or perhaps they were more fortunate. depending on one's perspective. Those who remained in the water near the site of the sinking spent a hellish night surrounded by death, by bodies floating face down, by the groans of the wounded and the terrible silence that followed as one by one those groans ceased. They clung together in groups, trying to stay awake, trying to keep each other alert, because falling asleep meant slipping beneath the surface and not coming back up. And when dawn broke, they saw the most beautiful sight imaginable. A PBY Catalina flying boat, its broad wings catching the morning light, circling overhead. The PBY pilots were legends in their own right, men who flew the lumbering seaplanes into combat zones to rescue downed airmen and stranded sailors, who landed on hostile waters and took off overloaded with survivors, who risked everything because someone had to and because it was the right thing to do. The pilot that morning saw the cluster of men in the water and did not hesitate. He brought the Catalina down in a long gliding approach, the hull kissing the surface, the spray flying up in sheets, and then the big plane was wallowing in the waves, its crew throwing out lines and life rafts, hauling men aboard with desperate haste. They packed the Catalina far beyond its rated capacity. Men sitting on the floor, standing in the aisles, clinging to any handhold they could find. The plane was so heavy that when the pilot gunned the engines for takeoff, it seemed for a moment that they would not make it, that the Catalina would simply refuse to lift off, would skim across the water until it struck a wave and cartwheeled into destruction. But the pilot coaxed it into the air through sheer will and skill, the engines roaring, the hull finally breaking free of the water's grip, and they climbed slowly, painfully, back toward American-controlled airspace, back toward safety. Not everyone made it. 37 men from the USS Cooper died that night, their bodies lost to the sea or burned in the explosions or simply too exhausted to keep swimming. But 154 survived, pulled from the water by Filipino resistance fighters and PBY crews, by luck and courage and the stubborn refusal to let the ocean claim them. They would carry the scars of that night for the rest of their lives, physical and mental, the memories of drowning ships and burning oil and friends who did not make it home. But they had survived. And their mission, though it cost them their ship, had succeeded beyond all expectations. The attack on Ormoc Bay crippled Japan's ability to resupply Leyte. The transport ships sunk, the docks destroyed, the supply depots reduced to smoking craters. These losses could not be replaced. Not quickly. Not with American forces tightening their grip on the Philippines with every passing day. The next morning, December 7, 1944, 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, Douglas MacArthur launched his masterstroke. 8,000 American troops landed at Ormoc itself, behind Japanese lines, supported by naval gunfire and air cover. And they surged inland with the momentum of men who knew victory was within reach. The Japanese defenders, already reeling from weeks of combat, already starving and low on ammunition thanks to the destruction of their supply lines, tried to mount a defense but crumbled under the assault. American forces advancing from the north and south linked up with the landing force, encircling the remnants of Yamashita's army, cutting them off from reinforcement or retreat. In a final act of desperation, the Japanese High Command ordered one last convoy to Ormoc Bay, 7 transport ships escorted by destroyers, loaded with thousands of troops and supplies. The convoy sailed into the bay on December 11th, unaware that the Americans had already secured the harbor, unaware that they were sailing not toward salvation but toward annihilation. American aircraft fell upon them like wolves on wounded prey, dive bombers and torpedo planes attacking in waves, and the convoy was obliterated. Every transport sunk, every destroyer damaged or destroyed, thousands of Japanese soldiers drowning before they ever saw the shore they were meant to defend. It was a massacre, the final punctuation mark on the campaign for Leyte. By Christmas of 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Leyte had collapsed. Yamashita's remaining forces retreated into the mountains, reduced to scattered bands of starving, sick, demoralized men who would continue to fight and die in the jungles for months, not because they believed in victory but because surrender was not in their code. The American flag flew over Ormoc Bay, over the shattered docks and burned-out warehouses, and the supply convoys that now sailed through those waters carried food and ammunition for MacArthur's forces, not for the Emperor's. Leyte was liberated. The road to Manila, to the heart of the Philippines, lay open. The cost had been staggering. Thousands of American soldiers and sailors killed or wounded. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers dead. many of them young conscripts who had never wanted to fight but had been swept up in the machinery of war. Entire villages destroyed, caught in the crossfire between two empires. And one American destroyer, the USS Cooper, resting on the bottom of Ormoc Bay, a grave for 37 men who gave everything so that others might live, so that freedom might advance one bloody mile at a time across the Pacific. The men who survived would go home eventually. They would step off ships in San Francisco or San Diego, would feel American soil beneath their feet again, would embrace families who could never truly understand what they had been through. Earl H. Taylor would live a long life, would tell his story to anyone who would listen, would never forget the night he swam for his life through burning water while his ship sank behind him. The pilots who flew the overloaded PBY Catalina would receive medals and commendations, would shrug and say they were just doing their jobs, would fly more missions and save more lives before the war ended. The crews of the Moale and Sumner would return to the fight, would sail into more battles, would see the Japanese surrender and would finally be allowed to go home. And in Ormoc Bay, the water would grow calm again, the fires would burn out, and the jungle would slowly reclaim the ruins. But the bay would remember. The depth charges still buried in the mud, the wreckage scattered across the seafloor, the bones of ships and men who fought there. These would remain silent witnesses to the night when 3 destroyers sailed into hell and changed the course of history. The liberation of the Philippines would continue. Manila would fall. MacArthur would keep his promise. And the road that led there, the road paved with sacrifice and courage and blood, ran straight through Ormoc Bay, through that one terrible night in December when the ocean burned and men became legends. If the story moved you, if you felt the weight of what these men endured, then honor their memory by sharing this history. Hit that subscribe button because there are hundreds of stories like this one, stories of courage and sacrifice that deserve to be told, that deserve to be remembered. Smash the like button if you believe that the men who fought at Ormoc Bay, who swam through fire and darkness, who gave everything for a cause larger than themselves, deserve to have their story heard. And I want to know, if you had been aboard the USS Cooper that night, in that moment when the torpedo struck and you had less than 60 seconds to decide whether to live or die, what would you have done? Would you have jumped into the burning water? Would you have stayed to help your shipmates? Leave your answer in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation alive. Because as long as we remember, as long as we tell these stories, these men will never truly be gone. They will live on in every word we speak, every memory we preserve. So remember them, honor them, and never, ever forget the night Ormoc Bay became a graveyard, and the men who survived to tell the tale.